past several weeks have seen unprecedented demonstrations, violence, and looting in the streets of American cities. There may have been other actors unbeknownst and unrelated to the millions of legitimate peaceful protesters and using it as a lever to drive American society apart. Hello, and welcome to This Will Happen. I'm John Jordan. The overwhelming majority of demonstrators just wished to express their pain and frustration, if not anger, at the murder of a young black man at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer. Overwhelmingly, Americans share this righteous outrage and wish to see this end. However, there may be more to the story. This decades-old racial wound in America's psyche could be being exploited, having nothing to do with the legitimate protesters filling American streets. Joining us today is Bernard Kerik, a former New York Police Department commissioner and interior minister in Iraq during the U.S. occupation there in 2003. Mr. Kerik is more than just another high-ranking police official. Mr. Kerik is somebody who grew up inside some of the toughest parts of the NYPD, including working in narcotics and undercover. Mr. Kerik gained broader experience working with other New York agencies, both state, local, as well as federal agencies in combating crime in America's largest city. You have such a broad background in your career that's germane to the events of the last couple of weeks. You started your career as a street cop in New York.
I was in Brooklyn, coming out of the academy. I was in a car there. Then I went to plain clothes. I rode around in a yellow cab in Midtown Manhattan. Keep in mind, this is back in 1988, 89, at the height of the crack epidemic in New York City. You know, we were averaging about 2,000, 2,200 murders per year.
And then you also worked in Washington Heights, and you also worked in narcotics, and you did a lot of undercover work too.
Yeah, I wound up in the DEA task force, and so I oversaw one of the most substantial drug investigations in New York history. New York City was failing, right? You had the highest murder rate, highest violent crime rate. People were sick and tired of living in fear. And then in 1994, when Giuliani was elected, where he came in, basically he said, you know, look, my first and foremost priority is going to be crime reduction, murder reduction, because nobody wants to work here, live here, go to school here, visit here if they don't feel safe. He was criticized at the time, you know, and the critics were saying, you're talking about putting a lot of money into the budget for the police department. You're talking about putting a bunch of cops in minority communities. But at the end of the day, over an 8-year period during Giuliani's time in office, we reduced violent crime by 63%, reduced overall murder in the city by 70%. And in those communities of color, whether it was Brownsville, Crown Heights, Bed-Stuy, so when you look back, who was the biggest benefactor to the crime reduction? The Black community. Where were the most lives saved? The Black community. We went from 2,200 homicides. The year that I went out, we had 671. And that number continued to drop over the next 12 years under Mayor Bloomberg because he maintained the same police strategies, the same type of enforcement.
Going to the instant case, the riots, and the importance of leadership in times of crisis, walk us through the beginning of the riots, how they impacted law enforcement, how they impacted the development of the riots, and how they're going to impact those communities where they took place.
Can't talk for every critical decision that was made because I wasn't a part of that process. But what I can tell you, you know, we deal in New York City, we deal with protests, peaceful protests, I don't know, 100 a week, 200 a week. We have a unit that deals strictly with protests. Unfortunately, these protests, as I saw them, when you have groups like Black Lives Matter and you have groups like Antifa, these are not going to be peaceful protests. We already know that. This was far more coordinated than anything anybody ever imagined. When you take a map of the United States, you're talking 42 states, maybe 72, 75 cities. This is an operation that would have cost in the tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, to have the resources, the manpower, the communications. Everybody's saying, well, they're peaceful protesters. Well, when you're looking at somebody that has a vest on and they have an earpiece on, and that earpiece goes to a paramilitary radio, that's not a peaceful protester. That's basically an operative. And anybody that knows the makeup of Antifa, it is a domestic terror group. It's a group that is formulated based on Marxism and communism.
The communities where this took place, the people that live there, lower income communities that were devastated as a result of this.
Well, listen, the majority, I think the financial damage was done in Midtown. Midtown, the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side was looted. They were all destroyed, physically destroyed. On the outskirts, up by Fordham in the Bronx, small communities where you have stores, mom and pop shops, destroyed. It was a money grab, and it was allowed to happen. And every other day, I heard them say, we're going to investigate the police for using force, when in the meantime, I'm watching cops get pummeled with bricks, bottles, stones. In the aftermath, it looked like a war zone, and they allowed it to happen. I think there's one thing that came out of this that a lot of people haven't focused on, and that's the psyche of the people of New York. They're scared to death. They are scared to death. Did somebody let it happen? But more importantly, that it could happen again. I've heard people that have lived in New York for 30, 40, 50 years, they're out. This reminds me of what happened back in the 80s, early 90s, when people wanted out of the city, and they wanted out because they were scared to death.
Can you talk to us about the different policing styles, the different types of mayors you had, and how that impacted those communities and how that impacted police interactions in those communities?
When I came on the job, I came in under Ed Koch. Within a few years, David Dinkins took over. And like I said, crime was rampant. The city was pretty much filthy. It was a place where nobody wanted to go. Live there, work there. Tourism was at all-time lows. When I first went to Major Case, my first day, it was like 1992, I guess, I was standing in front of the 2-6 precinct. I'd say within a matter of 10 minutes, I heard 3 different shootouts. Now I'm at a precinct. I'm standing in front of a precinct. This is really like a war zone.
During the 90s, when this was just beginning, when you were there and Mayor Giuliani had just been elected, and the mayor's catching all this flack for this departure from the Ed Koch and David Dinkins policing model, as crime rates came down, did they ever moderate their views or say, geez, you guys are right?
We saw crime reduction begin within 6 months. Did the general public see it, feel it? No, they weren't feeling it. And then as crime began to drop, what everybody started to realize was there was a shift in economic development, in real estate value, in tourism. And for every percentage point that we reduced crime and murder, we could show you increases in tourism, real estate values, and economic development, reductions in poverty. And then the general public got to see it. They got to feel it. They got to live it. The mayor gave them the opportunity to be independent. No more dependency on the government. Overnight, Harlem began changing, the entire city. But it would never happen if you didn't clean up the crime and violence. This is extremely important. When you hear the critics today talk about how some of these Black communities, it's socioeconomic, and it's, we need better businesses and we need better schools, all that stuff, I constantly remind them, you're never going to get it. You're never going to have that if you don't reduce the crime and murder, because nobody wants to go there. Nobody would work there. Do teachers want to go into a community where there's gunfire in and around the schools? No, they don't, as a result of those types of policies.
We learned a few things today. First, that prosperity can't happen without safety. Communities can't grow unless residents feel safe in their homes and feel safe enough to open a business and send their kids to school. In the 80s and early 90s, we saw this same drama play out. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And when we say this will happen, we can say that with confidence today because it has happened. Antifa, a group that will stop at nothing to further its radical leftist agenda to destabilize American society and intimidate Americans, demonstrated a frightening capability. What did Antifa bring to this protest, which is really different and unprecedented in American history? Hijacking legitimate protesters to sow division and to exacerbate America's cultural wounds. Here on This Will Happen, we embrace the challenge of looking into an uncertain future where respect, freedom, and prosperity are for everyone. I'm John Jordan. We'll see you next time.